Okay. So, hello and welcome again to Negotiating Digital Space in Culturally Significant Storytelling, a cross-cultural and interdisciplinary webinar series co-curated by Katie Graham and myself, Pallavi Swaranjali. We've been having these sessions for the past few weeks and really enjoying the conversations that have been generated in it. And we're very thankful for the sponsors who've supported us. This series is supported by a Sure Connection grant and also supported by the Carlton Immersive Media Studio as well as Art Engine. It is organized by the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats in association with the Bachelor of Media Production and Design program at the School of Journalism at Carleton University in Ottawa and the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College in Ottawa. It's a 7-part series and it runs from June 16 to July 28th, next week being our last week of the session with 2 upcoming webinars. Today we are very excited. We have 2 great speakers with us, Stephen Foster and Sojung Bong. And their session is called Narratives of Familiarity, Empathy in Storytelling. Documentary storytelling can provide viewers with an objective lens into different cultures and socioeconomic issues, expanding viewers' knowledge of other people's point of view and experiences. With the addition of immersive and interactive storytelling techniques, the viewer can become even further immersed in the experiences documented, enhancing their empathic response. However, immersive and interactive documentaries bring new challenges and ethical debates as they create false understanding in the viewer and portray the pain and experiences of others, usually minorities or the disadvantaged. Our speakers today will discuss the dangers of empathy and other ethical issues as they introduce their work in immersive and interactive documentary storytelling. I will hand it over to my colleague, Katie, who will introduce our speakers for today.
Yes, thank you, Pallavi. So I'm really excited to introduce these 2 speakers. I'm going to introduce both of them, and then I'm going to pass over the Zoom share function to Sojung, who will begin, and she'll present for 20 minutes, followed by Stephen. So first we have Sojung Bang, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at Carleton University, and she also holds a PhD from Sensi Lab at Monash University in Australia. She graduated from Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology with a master's degree in cultural technology and a BFA from Korea National University of Arts in TV and film production and art theory. Sojung will also begin a new position as assistant professor in media and performance production in the Department of Film and Media in the Dan School of Drama and Music at Queen's University in Canada. That begins in September. So Sojung explores cinematic media via digital technologies to reflect aesthetic and narrative experiences in cultural and philosophical contexts. Her interactive VR project, Sleeping Eyes, won the Award of Excellence at the Festival of International and Virtual Augmented Reality Stories, also known as 5 Hours. Sojung's 360 autobiographical documentary film Floating Walk was nominated for Social Impact Media Award in Los Angeles, and her film Poetry of Separation was screened at NDC in New York. Sojung's experimentations in architectural cinema and digital storytelling were exhibited at many international symposiums and conferences. So we welcome you, Sojung. Next, Stephen Foster. He is currently Interim Vice President, Research and Dean of the School of Graduate Studies at OCAD University in Toronto. He is a video and electronic media artist, and his work tends to deal with issues of Indigenous representation in popular culture through personal narrative. In addition to his exhibition record, Stephen is a published author, presented lectures, and has participated on panels for new media, video art and contemporary Indigenous art at national and international venues. He has taken part in residencies at the Banff Centre for the Arts, Klondike Institute of Art and Culture, Oboro in Montreal, and more recently at La Chambre Blanche in Quebec City. Stephen was awarded a large research creation grant from SSHRC for exploring interactive and experimental approaches to documentary. In 2009, he was nominated Best New Media Project at the Image Native Film and Media Arts Festival for his interactive DVD video project titled the Prince George Métis Elders Documentary Project. So we welcome you, Stephen. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Sojung take over, and we'll get to hear from her, and then Stephen followed. So welcome, Sojung.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Sojung Bang. I'm very honored to be here to talk about my works and have a chance to discuss around empathy and storytelling with an amazing artist and scholar like Stephen. So let me share my screen. Can you see that? My presentation slides? Great. So let me start my presentations. Thank you so much for inviting me, Pallavi and Katie. It's really good. It's a huge honor. I'm interested in exploring socio-cultural identity as a South Korean woman. And I'm also trying to rebuild and confront vulnerability and fragility as a human being. I'm also interested in exploring the limited perceptions we have shaped by socio-political infrastructure. I believe that interactive, generative, immersive elements of digital technology allow me to create artworks that let the viewers to actively explore and reflect on the social cultural issues around them. I will start talking about my first interactive documentary project that I made in 2014. This project might not be directly related to issues around empathy, but I want to briefly talk about this project because it makes me think about the roles of digital technology, especially in storytelling. Lost Fragments of Night is a poetic documentary film. It's about nighttime in Seoul. These projects are screened on 4-layer multi-screens and using a tag-based generative editing system to juxtapose montage. Seoul is often called the city that never sleeps. The South Korea went through compressed rapid modernizations, which also reflect a lot of fragmented and paradoxical images could be found night in Seoul. And I realized that at the time, mentally connecting those contradictory images in urban city are directly related to the techniques of montage in film, which is associated by the concept of city walking by Walter Benjamin. So I want the viewer rethink and reconstruct the familiar images of the night times in Seoul. So I use multi-layered screens and tech-based generative editing system to reach that goals. Let me play the videos. Due to the time limit, I will skip a lot of technical details. This is the interesting images that I encountered when I simulated that generative systems. So as you can see, there are 4 images were juxtaposed: one plastic surgery, one church, one hotel, love hotel in South Korea, and one layer is about Korean shamanisms. If that images was created by an artist or something, I might try to find the artist's intention, but because of this was generated by computer system, it's let me think about reconnect the connections of the images. And I realized that all images are telling or showing the vulnerability and fragility of South Korean society in different ways. So these projects gave me a bit of like opportunity or hope to think about how digital technology can be used to confront or encounter the familiar things in unfamiliar ways and expand our perceptions. So now I will start talking about my PhD project, which is cinematic VR as a reflexive tool beyond empathy. I conduct my PhD study at Science Lab at Monash University in Australia. As many of you know, a lot of people argue that VR is a very good tool to create strong empathic experience because of it provided first-person perspective and strong sense of presence as if we are actually in there. Well, being in another world using VR, being in another person's shoes through empathy sounds like equivalent concept. But then how about this? Do you think this is empathy? I do not think a strong sense of immersions or presence are not directly related to quality of empathy. That is oversimplifications. And also, looking at other people's pain should not be taken for granted. As Levinas notes, we should not erase the difference between self and other. We should accept the limit of understanding. I do not discard the value of empathy or potentials of empathy machines. I rather emphasize the complications of empathy and dangers of simple identification or emergence without critical awareness. Empathy is a reflexive process. Let's say I empathize with Stevens. How do I know if I empathize with Stevens? It can be identification or projection or even idealizations. Then ironically, it makes me think about, I should think about how I perceive Stevens and my feelings toward him. In the Buddhist philosophy of mind, empathy is kind of self-extensions that requires complicated or complex reflexive process. As you know, in many films and art forms, there has been a lot of investigations of reflexivity, reflexive dimensions, such as back-to-back, distancing effect, estrangement effect, and avant-garde filmmaking techniques. However, explorations of reflexivity in VR sounds like contradictory because VR is immersive media, which kind of carries the potential dangers to break emergence. However, I believe that VR is fundamentally reflexive medium because of the limitations of engagement. Although VR technology has been developed rapidly, there is always technical restrictions. Also, we are existed in the virtual reality and physical reality simultaneously. There are always duality of embodiment and presence. So we can use this embodiment and physical estrangement, let the viewer to fill the gaps between physical sensations and virtual perceptions. So based on this idea, I produced 3 different cinematic VR projects using different levels of immersion and interactivity. Floating World is an autobiographical 360-degree documentary about myself. I used a 360-degree camera as a self-confrontational devices. Carrying 360-degree camera, I wandered around Australia and South Korea. And I try to find how my personal memories in Australia are directly or indirectly connect to historical memory, such as Korean War. Let me play the video.
Ready, police.
Everything is connected and changing. 79 years old.
So I often blended two cities, Melbourne and Seoul, to confuse viewers and let questions about where they're located. And I also rebuild camera to let them think about their body function as cinematic interface.
Am I in Melbourne? Am I Seoul? Are you in the virtual world? How do we perceive our bodies? As a mirror?
As a creator, making this artwork was the really self-confrontational, reflexive, and therapeutic process because I could see myself without filtering and framing, which is I never really seen myself in that kind of perspective before. So I could see that potentials of VR as auto-ethnographical tools, especially for immigrants. This almost zero budget personal project was nominated Social Impact Media Award, which was huge honor. And I realized that small personal things can be historical and how VR can be used as a social cultural devices. And this is the second project called Anonymous. This is the 3D animated VR film applying gaze interactions. As you can see, the virtual world are all created with cardboard materials. Anonymous is about non-relationship society, which refers to a lot of people live and die alone, especially in South Korea and Japan. When I created this project, I lived alone and I had a vague fears of dying alone as a foreigner, and which makes me think a lot about these issues. And I've conducted the field research in South Korea, and I help older people cooking and cleaning their house for a few weeks. Based on the field research, and I reconstructed their stories to share the stories around the relationship society and loneliness and death. Let me play the video. So basically, the viewer embodied the deceased wife's perspective. So deceased wife, we, the viewer, embodied the object. When we gaze at certain object, we become an object. And through the object perspective, we observe the older man's lives, such as through TV, telephone, butterfly, light bird. And after the ceremony, the viewer, the dead wife, leaves homes and becomes the star. Being a dead person and embodying objects were used as a physical estrangement to let viewers to think about the issues around loneliness and death. Also, we know how cardboard materials feels like, but we never really live inside of the cardboard. So it created tensions between familiarity and unfamiliarity. I also use a motion capture device to animate the character. So it created a lot of glitch. So there are tensions between human-like movements and cardboard materials. We also used sounds made by cardboard and paper with the sound designer Toby. So the sounds also very familiar, but really weird. We conducted audience study to find out how reflexive elements were used to create it anonymous. And we found that those are 4 materials were used to create a reflexive dimensions. Here is the examples from audience interview. I also made it the environments pretty ritualistic when I installed the anonymous, especially a lot of audience whose family members passed away cried a lot. So I always try to bring tissues for them. I saw beautiful ritualistic potentials of VR through making this project. Sleeping Eye is the collaborative project that I made with South Korean media artist Sung Lee. He is diagnosed with narcolepsy, which is the neurological disorder that fell asleep uncontrollably. When he talks about his narcoleptic states, he'd always talk about quantum mechanics because he said that he feels like a here and there at the same time, dream and reality at the same time. And he talked about the social violence he had, especially in South Korean army and high schools, due to the ignorance of narcolepsy. So through using a VR, we try to represent his narcoleptic states as well as social ignorance of narcolepsy.
I feel like I am in the 2 places at once. Kind of like a superposition of quantum mechanical states. I am both awake and asleep. Here and not here at the same time.
We also used a gamification technique to let viewers to confront and experience the uncomfortable situation that someone may face. For example, the viewer needs to avoid the laser from student's eye and escape the room. So interestingly, that game-like interaction were used to experience the limitations and frustration, not for winning. We also used a heart rate sensor. So heart rate variability is associated with the viewer's stress state. So the HRV are mapped to the visual aesthetics, such as color and situation. And also heart rate is synchronized with the beating sounds and the flickering light. So those kind of physiological sensors were also used to let the viewer to aware of their physical sensation and response toward the artwork. So we found that those kind of duality of existence that coming from virtual reality can be fundamentally related to narcoleptic states. So we use that sort of the physical restrictions as reflexive devices to think about narcoleptic states and social ignorance. This is the drawings from Sangin. And for 2 years of, I've put a lot of effort to empathize with Sangin, but I can't. I have to accept that I cannot fully understand Sangin. He should be remain as otherness to me, and I accept and I learn the limitations of empathy and understandings of other. So I stopped representing his inner state. Rather, I became a mediator and revealed the social ignorance around narcolepsy. In general, based on the PhD projects, those are my main learnings. So reflexive immersive elements are not separable. Those are interrelated. And understanding others involve constant attempts, which is contextual and changing. And exploring the reflexive dimensions of VR could be give the viewer opportunity to rethink about their familiar sensation or situation in unfamiliar ways. It could be related to the expectations of their perception. It can be both reflexive and empathetic. And based on the learnings, and I realized that although I try to make the storytelling very reflexive or ethical, in nonfictions, if I do not create the work with the central character, we never really know if I actually deliver or share the central character's perspectives or feeling. And then it made me more think about or interested about participatory and collaborative digital storytelling. And I started to investigate this element more when I started my postdoctoral position at BMPD in Carleton University. This is the collaborative project that I had with 8 BMPD students. So we create autobiographical VR shorts about their pandemic experience. So we conducted workshop online, and I try to translate their idea to create the storytelling fit into the format of VR. But let me play a video.
It feels as if I'm able to see all of the beautiful things in life, but not experience them, like I'm trapped in some sort of glass dome.
My hopefulness for the future has stayed with me. I just hope the future will be kinder.
Made me develop a bad habit of overeating.
I would like to think that with the vaccines being distributed, it would be over soon. But here we are again in lockdown with no end in sight.
I felt I'm a man walking on a Mobius Street.
And we go in, the alarm's blaring, because we're in a lockdown, and this is probably the hardest part of COVID.
By 22nd January, there were thousands of confirmed cases.
I awake, push my newfound veins around. I wake up in water. I thought I was already awake. It's a chore to keep my eyes open. They sink.
So based on the workshop and interview with them, we try to find how 3D-based VR can be a meaningful autobiographical devices, and we found these 4 factors. These are the examples from the interview. I will leave it there a bit. And I'm also collaborating with a lifestyle design company called Asian Lab. And we are collecting stories from the people who are living alone. And based on their stories, we are developing self-care applications. So due to the time, I'll skip the details of the applications. But we are still collecting collecting and analyzing the story of people who are living alone, especially in Ontario. And then based on that, we are refining the functions of mobile applications. But lastly, I recently conducted an AR workshop with a South Korean artist. BMPD director Vicky MacArthur has been doing a lot of research around democratizations of AR storytelling. So using her framework, I conducted a workshop with artists who never have experience in AR technology, but coming from different backgrounds, such as music, photography, design, or drama, or films. It was really interesting to see how they translated their creative methods and pushed their boundaries of creativity using AR. So I found that they try to find a way to reduce the barriers of participations in new media storytelling will be very important, especially for like democratizations of storytelling. So due to the time, I'll skip a lot of details of the project. So in short, as a creator, as an artist, I'll put my effort to create an ethical and reflexive storytellings, but simultaneously, I want to facilitate it and support community members to develop and bring their own story using digital technology. So if you have any questions or interested collaboration, please reach out to me. And I'll hand it over to Stevens for his amazing talk. And I'm looking forward to having a discussion later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sojung. So just as she mentions, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen now. If what we'll do is, I forgot to mention this before, but after both present, we will open up a conversation. In the meantime, if you wanted to use the chat or the Q&A to ask any questions, you can put them there and we'll bring them up during the conversation time. So thank you very much, Sojung. And Stephen, welcome to share your screen. Sojung, you'll have to stop sharing your screen first. Thank you.
Are we, sorry, are we seeing just the main screen or are we seeing multiple windows? Okay, we're good. Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Sojung, for that lovely presentation. Really inspiring. Yeah, so I thought I've talked about a few different projects, kind of coming at interactive narrative kind of structures in my work, and also the kind of layering I do around remediating imagery, popular images of indigeneity, and bringing in issues of representation and these kinds of things. My background. I am of mixed ancestry. I'm Haida and European mixed ancestry. I grew up on Vancouver Island on Snanahas territory. And of course, I've spent a lot of time in British Columbia, in the Okanagan, where I worked for many years at UBC Okanagan as a professor, media arts, but also as an academic administrator before coming here. to Toronto, where I am currently situated on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. Yeah, let me begin with talking about some of my projects. I thought I'd go back a little ways in time and talk about one of my first, well, not one of my first projects, but a project I did just titled Remediations. And the idea behind it, there was a few works in this series that did get shown, and the show itself was a two-person show with John Gillespie that traveled kind of all over Canada. And they were a series of lightbox structures and installations. This one's called Death of Empire, and it's from 2006. It's in my work, I kind of try to play with the history of images, but also and their trajectories in terms of the way images kind of build connotations and meaning. And then I kind of try to subvert that a little bit. So in these works, and I'll just show you a little close up here. Of course, it's me, maybe a younger version of myself in various dress. And these are composite photographs. And so just to kind of give you an idea of the layering of the images in here in the context, a lot of these are, like I say, are composite images. So like, the briefcase is montaged in, some of the dress is montaged in as well. But here, I'm using like a headdress, but it's not a headdress that would be worn in my particular culture, Haida culture, but it is a headdress that maybe is referencing Plains culture, but in fact it is also referencing it is specifically a costume for the village people, the Sevenese music group, and the character that used to present themselves as an indigenous character in that group. So it's kind of like this layering of pop culture in there. The painting backdrop is lifted directly from a Paul Kane painting, who's a very famous painter in the turn of late 1800s, who spent a lot of time traveling throughout Canada and North America, making paintings, very romanticized paintings of indigenous groups, including Plains people, and things like that. So, and then just, referencing the kind of traditions of the colonial, legacy, the aggressive nature of it, the oppression, but also thinking about the inversion of that, so that's part of it. Here, using the same costuming a little bit. This one's called Transmission, but here we see a reference to the probably famous, test pattern that was used on for TV stations when the broadcast day was over, you would have this test pattern that would just be broadcast, and it always had this Indian head for some inexplicable reason on it. And here again, you see the reference to the kind of Plains imaginary Indian, basically. And so again, I'm referencing that. This pose is a little bit based on kind of Atlas. So there's kind of this mixing of different kinds of layering of information there, and from images that come from different sources. What's also maybe not apparent in this particular reproduction, these are large light boxes, so you can get up close to them and see quite minute detail. And this is where the compositing becomes very apparent, because the images are textured in certain ways to represent their kind of media sources. So in this particular case, the figures themselves appear to be video projections. They have scan lines in them as if a video projection blown up. to life size, which is exactly what it is. And so the figure kind of glows a little bit, and then has these scan lines that one associates with video media. Other times I'll use the halftone print kind of image from newspapers and things like that to give a different kind of texture, so a different kind of reading, and then it's montaged together. So this is kind of that kind of layering of media and technology, but with the intent to reference that media and those sources, as well as the kind of combining that with images that are sourced or reminiscent of other sources. So that's clear. So that was Remediations, and it was a larger project. There was many more works in that series, but I just showed those couple there. This is moving on a little bit to a project that I called Remediating Curtis, and it had kind of several phases to it, and I worked on it for quite a while. I was probably starting about 2011, 10, somewhere in there, through to the current time here. And I don't know how many people are familiar with Curtis, maybe in this audience, but Edward Sheriff Curtis was an early ethnographer from the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century. And again, he had this kind of romantic vision, and he really had this almost calling, where he was going out to capture and document the indigenous peoples of North America. He had this big project called the Indians in North America Encyclopedia, and document them photographically and capture them before in his kind of way of thinking before their culture vanished. So he had this very specific viewpoint in terms of what he thought about the culture, and he thought it was a dying culture or dying cultures, and therefore that he wanted to preserve it. So it's kind of it's based in a type of approach called salvage ethnography, and that's what he was trying to do. But in a way, he was also freezing those cultures in time or misrepresenting them in relationship to their contemporary context. So you would see a lot of that kind of work, where he, like, if there was anything that represented kind of modern European contact or anything like that, he would airbrush it out of the photographs, or he would make people, if they looked a little too white, they'd make them wear shoe polish, or in the Northwest Coast where people had short cropped hair, he would make them wear these long wigs. And he had this kind of package, this trunk of costumes that he would drag around from place to place, and he would often dress people up as he thought they should look. And especially on the Northwest Coast, he would have them wear clothing that was, at least 200 years out of date for their current context. So you wouldn't see portraits of people with button blankets. You would have seen portraits with the woven cedar blankets, these kinds of things. And here we have a portrait, which is showing a headdress. And the reason why I use this one, this is not from the Northwest Coast, but the reason why I use it is because I always want to make that connection between how that kind of early ethnographic work impacts contemporary popular culture. And so I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but this is a slightly dated movie now as well. But this is Johnny Depp as Tonto in The Lone Ranger from a few years back. But you can see him using that same headdress in the video, which he references from this painting by Kirby Sattler, who incidentally, Sattler wasn't trying to show the headdress being connected there, the crow being connected to the headdress, but trying to show the crow behind the head. But irregardless, it's this connection to the original E.S. Curtis photograph. So it's interesting how it bleeds in, even though these things are often, from at the point of Curtis, were often artificial constructs. And this is a typical photographic work by Curtis, and then one of his early ones called Vanishing Race that really sets the tone for what he was trying to say and do. And he had lots of support from from Teddy Roosevelt and onward, but his project ultimately kind of bankrupted him. But he made significant projects, significant amount of work, did a significant amount of documentation, which is important in a lot of ways. And you're seeing now quite often you see certain groups kind of reappropriating those imagery or those images and remediating them, reclaiming them, remediating them, transforming them into a relevant context of their own culture. Not just in popular culture, I'm talking about within the specific cultures of those people. So for instance, there's a dance group out of Alert Bay that does dances based on the Curtis films, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then they in that sense, they're reclaiming it. And the fact that the people in the photographs are actually real people, they're people's grandparents, they're people's, elders from their communities, they're recognized people. So there's a bit of that kind of celebrating them through those works as well. So there's like this attempt to reclaim and recapture agency that's really important in that work. And in a sense, that's what I'm trying to do too. In this work here, I did a series of works where I took these toys that were made by this German company, Schleck. They make a lot of really highly detailed toys for kids and things like that. And they become quite collectible. In this case, they had a whole Wild West series, and you could see a kind of influence from early ethnographic photographs where they were taking that as their source and then creating it. Whether they were using Curtis specifically, I'm not confident enough to say yes, but often there's strong connections to some of his photographic work. So in this case, I took one of the toys and did a montage recreating that kind of Vanishing Race photograph from the previous slide. And again, these are large light boxes. And I've also done it in a kind of 3D. So that's why you're seeing that color shift. And so if you were wearing 3D glasses right now, they would pop off the screen and be very three-dimensional for you. Yeah. Here's another work. These are the Hopi snake priests, which is one of Curtis's early films too. But he did a series of photographs on it, and you can see the headdress here. And it's a very famous film because the Hopi, because they were kind of not as trusting of Curtis, and they certainly didn't want to reveal some of their deep spiritual associations with the dances themselves, and reveal their full ceremony. They reputedly, anyway, danced the sequences backwards so that they were not performing the actual ceremony. It was a way of ensuring that was not being transmitted. And there's more complicated stories around that. Here you can see this is the toy, and my attempt to create a portraiture of the toy in the Curtis style. So these are a little bit humorous. And again, the 3D effect is on there as well. And the reason why I chose to do that 3D effect is I was also at the same time trying to reference these kind of 1950s Hollywood movies of Westerns that were done with 3D video. It was very popular in the 1950s to do these Westerns with the kind of the 3D effect for audiences. So I wanted to reference that pop cultural element as well. So you had this kind of three layers: the very contemporary with the toys, to the 1950s connection, right back to the Curtis. And the titles generally came from what the toy was titled. So in this case, it was Sue Medicine Man. This gives you an idea of one of the sets for his film, Curtis's film, In the Land of the Headhunters. Quite a bit of work was done And it was kind of important again for some of the local cultures too. So I want to suggest that the cultures had some agency in these films. So it wasn't completely devoid of that. And you can, one of the important elements was for the people at the time was they got to recreate a lot of their artwork. They got to perform their dances. And even though it was for the purposes of his film, which is a very highly romanticized film, which has a narrative that has nothing to do with the ceremony or culture of the Kwakiutl people, but instead it has a kind of narrative that's really based in a kind of, romantic, pre-Hollywood, but romantic idealization of indigeneity. But what's important here is that it was done at a time when people were not allowed to practice their own culture. Certainly weren't allowed to perform potlatches and things like that. So they were able to do that and perform it and make objects for the film. They were allowed to do that because that's a special kind of license at the time for them to do that. So it did have an importance there for the people. And even now, it's a reference point for certain groups. And here is a version of that dancing around the fire, which of course is a very Hollywood iconic image, which of course, has its origins, maybe not completely with Curtis, but certainly Curtis used that image, which then became very iconic in there as well. And here again, I'm using the toys to represent that. And again, here is the how they would be installed. So they're quite large photo prints in light boxes, and with the 3D effect, they really, they come into the space and become quite immersive as you move around the space, and they tend to move with you as you go into the space with the glasses on. Now, there's a second part to this, which I took on was to create an interactive environment with remodeling the actual stage that Curtis created for the film In the Land of the Headhunters. And what I did was I looked at a lot of photographs. We looked at see if we could get different angles on things, and then I worked with the team and we rebuilt the stage in I can't remember the software we did. I think probably 3D Max or something like that. And then we put it into a video environment, so it was projected on a large screen. And I'll just show you one version of it that we did, which was a smaller version, but this is a version I did for the Surrey Art Gallery. Now, the other component of this is there's projected these loops with sound and video that project into the 3D space while there's the text over top, and those loops are triggered by interaction with the toys, which are on top of the this table here. Here's a little detail. So they're on there. So where you place them on the table triggers different loops, different sound elements to play in the space, and different elements to project onto the 3D stage. And this was done with some sensors. Later on, I did a kind of a 3D Max, Max MSP kind of version with a sensor that read any changes in light as the objects moved across the table. And then later on, I used RFID sensors and had each toy tagged to a certain code so that it would be more systematic. You move one and you move it around the table. You put it over one sensor, it would trigger a specific loop. So interactive elements, it creates kind of an interactive narrative in the way that it transforms the image on the screen that you're watching and what's being played in the environment, but not a linear narrative. Okay, now this brings me to the larger project here, which maybe comes into what we're talking about here today, This is the Prince George Métis Elders documentary project. It kind of started about 2004, maybe a little bit earlier, because we did some preliminary work before we started actually working on the documentary project itself. And what was important is we didn't go in specifically to make an interactive documentary. This is kind of before at least the notion of interactive documentary was really out there. And there was several people though, who I later became in contact with that were developing ideas around creating interactive documentary at the time, and much more specifically documentary. But the reasons we developed it in this way was, and I'll get to this in a minute, but the reason why we developed it was we were kind of looking for a way to be more inclusive and be more representative of the communities and communities within and around this kind of diasporic community of Métis elders that were living in and around Prince George. Okay, so back up and just talk about the community itself for a little bit. So Prince George, I don't know if people know that town or city in kind of the central British Columbia, but it's kind of a river city, and it has the Fraser River and the Chaco River that come through the city, and they meet there, and they form a little island in the middle, sort of thing. And this was a place it was called the Island Cache, and this is a place where a community developed of Métis that were coming in and out of Alberta, out of northern British Columbia. They had lineage connections all the way back to the Red River, but during the fur trade, we came in and migrated into this area, and we're working with the Hudson's Bay Trading Company, Northwest Trading Company, to during the fur trade. Also, they worked in, later in other industries and forestry and other things like that. But they really developed a community on this island where the city of Prince George kind of developed around it. But in the 1970s, the city decided to annex that community. They felt like they wanted to use that as a kind of industrial area. And so they just went in and they started bulldozing. They decided that the houses were no good. They decided that the community was a bit of a problem. It was a lower income community, these kinds of things. So they attempted to erase it. So this is not an uncommon story in Canada for sure. And the only thing that maybe is a little bit more apparent is that it's so recent. Of course, like I said, this happened in the 70s all the way through late 70s, where there's this kind of attempted erasure of the community, which is interesting now, because now they have a park in that area. The industrial area has completely fallen out, and they've created this park along the waterfront of the river, which is with walkways and everything like that. But they do not mention the community at all, which is still a concern or an issue. Anyway, so we worked with these elders on projects on this project, and again, the process was kind of a modified PAR. I mean, participatory action research project. We weren't attempting to, like in a typical PAR, to offer training and so that they could develop their own voice per se. We weren't trying to do that so much as trying to, because, well, for one, they didn't want to really learn the tools. They didn't want to do that. What they wanted to do was direct us on what to document and what was important to them. So there was a lot of working with, a lot of, even before we started filming, there was a lot of community activities we engaged in to build these kind of relationships and trust. We worked with some core group of elders that were kind of giving us direction, but we were going to bingos and going on picnics and other cultural events, and which later on became road trips and whatnot. I'm just going to play a little clip so you get an idea of what they were thinking about the project. Where's my mouse? There we go.
Well, I'd like to see the elders do this project because we're getting into the age group now where every year we're losing so many. And just last month, we lost 3 elders from the 18th of December to the 25th, like. So, you know, a lot of knowledge goes with every elder.
I've been wanting to see a project like this, like in an urban setting, you know, because the people that moved from their, you know, like from their homes where they were brought up traditionally, and they come into urban area and they lose the culture. So I always wanted to see something like this going on, so we could have that education to pass on to the younger ones, and that they could see it, and they could see like their grandma or whoever that's in that video.
So it can be taught and people can learn from it. For a lot of the elders that are passing away, I mean, they take a lot of the information with them. So, I mean, I think this is a great opportunity for young people and even some of the older Métis to learn some more about their culture and their traditions.
Yeah, so I think there was some core things they wanted to accomplish. They wanted to have something that would document the presence of their community in that place, on that island cache. They wanted to have, this kind of representation of their culture, and they wanted to, be able to use it to communicate with others in their community, to use it as a way to bring their community, which is now existing in this diaspora kind of situation, kind of back together. So there was these kinds of elements they were wanting to try to do. So here, I'll go to the next one. So the process was kind of, like I was saying, it was a modified kind of PAR. So we did a lot of work and taking of direction, working in multi-generational kind of situations with children and with the elders, going out onto the land, documenting a lot of, like in this particular case where it was a picnic, but we were also documenting, all the kind of medicines and things like that were, important knowledge that they felt they wanted to communicate to their group, but also not just to their group, but to outsiders. So like to people outside their group. So it's kind of an internal representation, but also an external representation that they wanted to do. And specifically the external part was more about, documenting that this community existed and exists, and that history of the cache itself. So that was some of the important elements and sort of the process that we were working with. And we kind of, like I said, we didn't start with the idea of making it an interactive documentary, but as we moved through it, we realized the stories were so diverse. There were so many different types of stories. And if one was creating a traditional documentary, we felt that it would leave so much out that, it would be a very exclusionary process. Because, when you're doing a traditional documentary narrative, you're trying to construct a story, a specific story. And, there were so many different pieces there that one could take on. By doing something interactive and non-linear in its sense, we could address a few different areas all at once. And we could also show the kind of respect to all the participants by making sure that everything is included. And it kind of creates this kind of archive. It's kind of a complicated archive, but an archive of sorts. And we kind of were looking at some early PAR processes, like the FOGO process that was developed with Colin Lowe and people out of Memorial University in Newfoundland around these kind of almost meta conversations, documentaries. I think Colin Lowe called them vertical documentaries, in that there were these videos, segments that really on their own didn't complete a story, but eventually did complete a story. If you watched through a few of them, it give you an overall picture of the community that he was trying to document at the time. In this case, it was, we kind of adopted that kind of strategy in a way, but now we're adding an interactive element. And I can talk more in detail about that in the question period. This is another short clip. I'm going to play just a part of it though, because I don't want to take up too much time here. This is the Island Cache, so just get a sense of some of the ways we constructed these kind of short, almost documentaries that maybe didn't have an obvious middle, beginning, middle, and end, but contributed to the overall portrait of the
9th Avenue, 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue, all the way down. And when you look at it, you have to visualize. There's nothing but industry and everything here, but you have to visualize a whole community that was there. There was real people that lived there. They had families, and when you look at the layout, it was like a typical neighborhood community. Most of the families came from Alberta or Saskatchewan. Yeah. A lot of Métis people that actually lived here. One, I guess it was a lower cost housing. Yeah. But I think what attracted people was the fact that there was other people just like them that lived here. Right. It was quite the community. It was a close-knit community. People cared for each other. They would watch over.
So you kind of get an idea of how the segments would work. Now, one of the things we tried to do in the interactivity, there was a couple of things we tried to do because of we weren't working with, certainly virtuality wasn't around at that time in a sophisticated way. And even though, we could have done something for the web, we felt like the type of interactivity you were getting in the web was very different from what we wanted to construct for this project. And also because we were dealing with what is essentially a northern community, certainly the internet there was terrible at the time, so it wouldn't have been accessible to them. And the important element was that it had to be accessible to them, the community, and certainly to be able to bridge that kind of multi-generational gap. And so we constructed it with DVD technology. And there was another element that I think was important here too, because one of the, this is a gifting society, a gifting culture. And the nice thing about we could put a DVD in a package and, and that is something they could gift to other people, each other. And so they were able to have something very tangible. And it also for some of these people, some of the elders especially, who were not as technically savvy, perhaps this technology was much more approachable and much more accessible. And they could watch it in a variety of ways. They could just stick it in and watch it, or they could, and it'll watch through various segments for them, or they could jump around. And you can see in the subtitled areas, we created these kind of like buttons, and you see them laid out here on the screen here, where people could jump to other narratives depending on what they wanted to do. If they were more interested in cultural elements, like wall tents, weaving, capote jackets, sewing, these kinds of things, those kind of traditional craft things, they could follow that along. If they're interested in music, they could follow the music along. We did a lot of recording of music. We also had the stories of the community and those kinds of things that could be watched as well separately. And people could also follow it along for their family member. Like, so they could, click as, their grandmother was in the the video, they could follow to the next clip of her or the next story she told, or likewise. Sorry. So it's kind of constructed that way. And here you see an example of that, where you have Rose, Eileen, and Harold. So that those are sort of three of in this particular stream anyway, that you could link off of to follow. You could also follow certain sites of significance like Lac St. Anne, Fort St. James, which were important spaces religiously for the Métis people, but also for this community. Sorry. And this just gives you an idea of the level of interactivity. It's kind of a crazy screenshot, but it shows you how everything is interconnected. So, you know, in a typical interactive kind of project that maybe would have been on the web at the time, or even now is this kind of tree format. Well, we weren't trying to do that. We weren't trying to go like a choose your own adventure kind of thing, although you could do that. It wasn't a tree structure though in its interactivity. It was more like a web or a kind of a rhizome kind of interconnected network that just kind of was very organic in a way. And that's kind of what we were trying to create in this project. So things are very much interlinked. And in fact, if you started watching it, if you just popped it in, you would eventually get around to watching everything if you wanted to, but it would just take a really long time. This kind of gives you an idea of the way the streams kind of worked more specifically. So if you started off in any one stream, the scenes are shared in any one of the streams. So that's they can be. So as you're watching, you might cross a stream, an intersecting stream, and then jump off at that point. But it would eventually bring you back into the mainstream. You could flip backwards and forwards. You can jump around in the streams themselves. So it's kind of a different kind of approach to interactivity, and that's why we couldn't really translate it to the web exactly, at least at that time. And then normally when we present it, in a gallery situation or at a community center, or these kinds of things, we have multiple monitors set up like kiosks, but we also have threads playing in an installation kind of context, kind of overlapping. So you get this kind of overlapping narratives, and you get this overlapping cacophony of sound, which kind of makes a bit of a sound collage. There's lots of music in there and things like that. So it kind of transforms, and as people activate it, different things are highlighted and come forward. So the narrative's always changing. The structure of the documentary is always changing depending on who's activating the work in the space. This was really an important kind of, metaphoric element that we wanted to, maintain in the work, and that, the simultaneity that's embedded in that process is something that, we felt represented the plurality and the multivocality of community and communities that were intersecting together here, in different ways. And so we felt like that kind of approach to interactivity really represented that. And then the kind of installation kind of element where it all kind of comes together really works for people. And when the community engages in it, they really quite enjoy just being able to jump around and look at different elements at different times, and coming to it, they might one day come in and look at just this, the next time they might come in and look at something else. So it really had an engagement and an immersive quality to it for the community itself, but also for people coming to it who had no knowledge of what this was about. They get a kind of sense of the diversity and the complexity, and the histories that were all present in the communities. So there's one last photo, so you get a kind of sense. There was a lot of journeys we took with the elders to different places, pilgrimages, things like that. So you can see a picture of Lac St. Anne in the background there. So those are represented as well as their journey. So it plays an important role. And I think that's where I want to leave off. So thank you very much. And it was great to have the opportunity to present this.
Thank you very much as well. It was very, very interesting. Now, if you could stop sharing your screen, we can open up the floor for conversation. As I mentioned before, anyone in attendance, if you have any questions you'd like to ask or any comments, feel free to use it in the chat function or in the Q&A, and we will make sure to get to them. I'm sure you guys have things you want to ask each other, but I'll just start in case as a prompt. And I just I'm just kind of thinking which. I wanted to bring up the idea of mediation since you both mentioned it in different ways. So Sojung and the idea of being the mediator of other people's stories, not trying to tell their stories, but help them tell them. And Stephen and the idea of the remediation of like previous representations. And I just thought that was a really interesting conversation thing. So I wanted maybe one of you or both of you to elaborate on that role of mediation in your work. Maybe I can get Sojung to start.
Yeah, so thank you for that very deep, insightful questions. Anyway, thank you so much for like amazing presentation, Stevens. In terms of like remediations and mediations, like I think there will be very different when I represent when I try to represent other people's stories or their perceptions. I don't think the mediation is actually happening to me. So it's more about the subject, me become a mediator. So to tell the story about other persons. So in terms of like, I think, I don't know, like what I'm talking about it, but the reason why I stopped trying to represent someone's inner state, because of I found that limitations of mediating his states. So that's one of the reasons I let him to create it, or I try to facilitate a community member to bring those stories. So I don't know, this is still very typical questions to how I could be the mediator for the community members or to other people. So that's I try to find the strategic methodology. For example, like workshop-based research and ethnographic research. So that kind of like rigorous strategy for facilitating participatory storytelling will be very important. I realize that just mediating other people's stories is not just attitude, it's more about strategies. In terms of media I use, for me, remediations is not just using different like various types of like multimedia elements to represent many kind of artistic form using different way, or represent reconstructions of existing element, more about pushing the boundaries of creativity. So in terms of that, let people observe the familiar sensation in familiar way. So that's why I try to use different kind of like a lot of like combinations of physical materials and virtual materials, and like a lot of different elements or alienated effect or familiar effect. It's more about facilitating the extensions of their perceptions, kind of break the bias or stereotypical identifications of materiality or social cultural issues. I'm not sure my answer is clear, because it brings a lot of questions about mediation, connection, materiality, but I'll hand it over to Stephen, and then maybe we can specify the ideas around that.
Yeah, I think there's mediation and then there's remediating. I think one can be a mediator in representing, like in the case of the construction project, trying to represent the community and trying different ways to do it. But some of my other work, of course, is about remediating. So taking representations that have already been constructed and that history of how they were constructed, and then trying to inform that complexity around how that image was constructed, that history of it. and then mediating that. So it's kind of so there's that going on. And then there's also this kind of notion, which I talked about before, where there's kind of a reclaiming of that imagery and that identity, and then transforming it. So I think, that's part of it. I mean, the part that I do in my work, I think, is about creating that complexity so that it kind of disrupts the maybe the romanticized imagery to a certain degree. In the Prince George project, I think, it was about trying to capture the complexities of what makes a community, more generally, but also how that community interacts with each other in that diasporic space, which was quite different of how they worked in as a cohesive community on the land in a specific way. So it's I don't know. Does that help?
If I may add to that, Katie, sorry, were you saying something? Did I interrupt?
No, you go.
Okay.
So I was also, when looking at both these projects, and my reading was that there was this vulnerability that was very, Sojan, you mentioned it in the beginning, a person who lives alone or a person with a particular kind of condition and so on. And Stephen, you talked about how, the religious practices didn't want to document it as is. So backwards. So I was wondering about the idea of vulnerability and this idea that you don't want yourself to be documented. That kind of a choice exists when you're the creator, and autoethnography is something where you decide whether you're comfortable with it or not. But when someone else is creating a documentary, and this whole idea of being exposed, were there any instances where people didn't want to, or they retracted and declined?
Because ours was a SHRC project, it had a very specific trigger points, consent processes that had to be followed, which we had to develop as we went to, in conjunction with SHRC, because this was an early kind of creation project and they hadn't really developed the guidelines as of yet. So there was a little bit of back and forth with that, but most definitely there was always the right to withdraw from the project, or withdraw your footage, or withdraw your things. And there was always these stages that we had where people could participate in how it looked like. So we'd have these group recording sessions where I play back segments of it. They would respond to it, and often this led to more conversation, which they were more happy about, to get into the representation, right, to get into the documentary. So we were able to do that as well. But there was a lot of opportunity to respond to what they've already said, or how they said it, or what they thought about was being said if someone else said something. So there was a lot of that going on. And I think in particularly in this, I'm not going to say all Indigenous communities are the same. It's certainly not homogeneous, but in this particular community, it's about retaining authorship. So if I say something, or I'm telling a story, it's my story, not yours. Just because you filmed it, it's still not yours. And that was very important that we did that, followed those kind of protocols as well. And that citations become much more, I think, obvious now. And I think people have really talked about the need to cite these stories. But when we were doing it then, I think, we weren't thinking about it as citation, but as respecting the source and the origins of that story, and the people that told that story. So that was another reason to do the interactive approach, because then we could be inclusive of all that. So when someone did tell us a story, they thought it was important to us. A traditional documentary, you might say, oh, well, that doesn't fit with what we're trying to do in the storyline here. And so you leave it on the cutting room floor, as it were. But we were able to still add that in and keep those kinds of things alive and try to honor them. Yeah.
But when you say it was their story still, do you think that digitizing it would somehow take away a little aspect of that belonging
Well, I think the object-oriented aspects of it, I think that's one of the things that allowed them to retain control quite directly. They can give it to whoever they want, take it back whoever they want. But I think, if it was a website or something like that, where it's open to be captured, I think that would be a problem. But it's one of the reasons why we explored the technology we did do. So it kind of had an object sense to it. Having said that, I think there's still a tendency, there's still that potential there for someone to take that and rip it and take that footage and do something else with it. But there is only so much control you can have on that. But I think at least this way, it made it more concrete for them in terms of the physical sharing and who gets to see it and who doesn't get to see it, kind of thing.
Actually, I'm going to use what you're talking about now to bring up a question that I think is very much connected in the Q&A, which is from Dan. And he asks, in these chaotic times, is there a medium to convey the legacy of the wisdom of the elders?
That's a good point. I'm not sure there is a perfect media for that. I think the perfect medium is actually not it is that direct one-to-one or direct connection one has. For me, doing the project, what was really important to me is even though I was walking around with a camera, and we did, I should say, a lot of the work was done off camera and without camera too, and maybe I didn't make that as clear. When we go out on walks in the land and the elders would show us stuff. I mean, the physical walking, the stories, when you're working with elders, I mean, they're telling you a story about something that's not necessarily connected to what you're actually doing. Like we were walking around the forest collecting Devil's Club kind of thing, and I think they're telling us a story that's the wisdom. It may be a narrative, it may be an old narrative, it may be a new narrative, but I think that's probably the best media for connecting with the elders, right? So
I actually have a question for Sojung. So I have a question for Sojung, which is about representation, because I feel that this connects to it. One about the technology, but now talking about the representation and the medium, like the method used. So for the anonymous one, for example, you used the 3D cardboards, and for the last video about the last one you showed, it was representations, but not realistic representations of people. And I thought that was really unique, because it actually, I felt like it made it so that I didn't feel like I was the one there, but felt like just exactly what you were describing, that it's not about trying to become, but to understand. Like you're not trying to become the person, but to understand it. And I was wondering if you did that intentionally, and also just with the idea of the cardboard, if it was chosen specifically because of the fact of how temporary cardboard is. Like why did you make those choices, and how did they, in your mind, help with the storytelling and that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's connected to the previous questions from Falavi as well, as you mentioned. I have a background in documentary filmmaking and TV journalism. And I always it's personally, I found it really difficult to capture the person who are in the difficult situations. And I always confronted ethical issues. This is the one of reason I try to focus on more about poetic reconstructions. And I start to think about a lot of issues around subjectivity and objectivities. Because as a creator, it's always really, really hard to sort of figured out about the issues around representations, and if I really capture the truth, or if I really sort of I can get the essence of what's really happening, or this is my perspective, because we always control the camera, we always control the editing and everything. Even if I try to bring the community members or central character to create a stories together, it always creates tensions between that. So that's the one of the main personal reason to start exploring more artistic investigations or aesthetics, and to focus on subjectivity. And your questions, Katie's question, also particularly related to VR. As you know, there are many different many sort of immersive journalism is created by 3Ds. So even if my first project is created using 360 degree cameras, when I try to put the interactions or navigations, it always requires a lot of 3D components. Then I started to think about the issues of representations. What's the roles of 3D and VR in terms of nonfictions? And when we talk about social issues, when we use a 3D and using a VR, what is the objectivity and where is subjectivity? It carries a lot of questionings around subjective perspective in alienations and those kind of things. So that's why I chose a lot of techniques that borrowing from a lot of artistic sort of artwork, like Brechtian distancing effect, or a lot of animated techniques, more artistic techniques that try to investigate and bring subjectivity to let viewer to explore their own perceptions rather than capture objective factual events or understand the social cultural or situation accurately, because of limits of the representations and the questionings around subjectivity.
Oh, wow, thank you. That's a great answer. It also makes me think of from Stephen, the use of the toys within your earlier one of the earlier projects, which reminded me of the artwork of Jeff Thomas. Just the idea of using the toys. Maybe you can talk, kind of continue what Sojung was talking about of a representation there and relating to that choice of using toys.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I am using the toys a little bit different. I think Jeff Thomas's work, for instance, I think utilizes the toys similarly to how I would use them. But he places them in picture in photographs, and they kind of create this dichotomy between the modern world and the historic, and this, especially this idea of land. Like, I don't know if he talks about it in this way, but kind of it does relate to the narratives around land claims anyway, that this having the figure positioned, the typical, I'm trying to think what that series of toys are called, but they're the Wild West toys, and they have the typical Plains chief with the spear, and he has the Toronto CN Tower in the background, that kind of thing. It's quite a powerful statement. Or some of his Sighting Indian projects, where he's going around and looking for monuments that represent Indians, and how they're positioned as monuments, and in relationship to the other whatever that monument is about, whether they're being cowering and being subservient as some dominating colonial forces oppressing them, or are they part of nature? They're depicted as just part of the flora and fauna of the wilderness, these kinds of things. So I think in that sense that that's a bit of what's going on in my work with the toys. But I think mine is more specifically about that kind of chain of representation that came up with those toys, that came up with the idea that, when Schleck was trying to think about, the toy company was trying to think about, let's make a Wild West series. Well, then where do we go for our sources for our toys? Let's go to, this. And then you can see how it gets kind of repeated throughout popular culture, that kind of notion, that kind of romanticized notion. And I think, in connecting it to Sojung's work, though, I think there is this material sensibility and layering of that's going on in your work that I find really attractive and interesting. And I also think that's something that is embedded in the kind of texturing that I do in my work. That kind of trying to create and I think in your work, it's more like it makes it more tangible, more fragile. I think you talked about it being more fragile by making it into the cardboard, but it's in a certain sense, I could imagine that going into a VR world like that, it would be much more engaging because it's not trying to be hyper real like so many games are, right, and things like that. Although that becomes very immersive, I think it becomes much more intimate when you have that kind of material sensibility going on. And for me, I mean, and playing with those kinds of materiality of the image, it does a similar sort of thing in that it in one sense it does kind of block the immersiveness, as it were. Like it makes it stops you from becoming fully immersed in the environment or in the image, and therefore just dismissing it as you would dismiss your normal everyday environment. Now you're being kind of prodded or poked as a viewer to try to think about why am I in a cardboard room? That simple, right? It's that simple. And I think that becomes more engaging. Yeah.
I have many other questions I can ask, but I think at this point, to make sure everyone gets to talk, I'll see if Stephen or Sojung have any questions for each other.
So I found that the use of like interactivity and participations for facilitating a lot of critical awareness will be really impressive, because you were in the early stage when you created interactive documentaries. So I'm really interested in how you design sort of the narrative. You briefly talk about interconnected narrative, but there are so many hypertextual where interactivity can just branching out. But how those like specifically that sort of use of interactivity affect the viewer to explore their stories, or as you can say, not really fully just immersive or rethink about or aware about their authentic stories around them. And even I was really curious of like when people encounter the toy toy portrait you created, if they don't know much about the concept of a lot of indigenous art or Curtis project, how they just find that, and what's your intention? Do you kind of want them to rethink about the representations of indigenous, or you kind of wanted to sort of provoke them to rethink about it, like the why you sort of reconstructed those images? Like what's your intentions?
Yeah, it's I think with the toys and that kind of level of interactivity, that one's actually an interesting challenge, because people, in art galleries, of course, are programmed not to touch anything, right? So it gets a little bit, to prompt them. I think some of the galleries said you can, hung up signs, because it showed in a few different places, a few different versions, that they put up signs, you can touch the toys, just don't take them. But I think, I think there is a challenge there in trying to get people to engage in their artwork. I think the first iteration I did with the toys, I think because they were just on the table, and they weren't in any particular way. And because the gallery was concerned about people stealing them, they put little chains on them, which I didn't really like, but they did it anyway. So that one was actually fairly inhibiting, I think. But later on, I put them on a little kind of puck pedestal kind of thing, the toys, and it became much more game-like. And I had a kind of more of like a board that looked like a game kind of thing that they could position them around. And they had these areas where they could put them on, and that would trigger the videos. And that became much more inducive to people activating them. They would want to activate them because they look like, oh, that looks like a game I can play, and then move things around, and it became much more interactive. In other projects, which I didn't show today too, I've done things where I just have motion sensors set up. As people move through a space, it triggers things. And at first, they're not necessarily aware that their movement is causing the video changes or sound changes, as the case may be. But as they continue to move around, they realize it, and then they become more engaged in trying to make it do stuff. I think in that way it kind of creates interactivity more directly. With the Prince George Métis Elders Project, it's more, I guess, that when we built that, we were more thinking that there was a predisposed engagement. Because the community was so involved in the project, they wanted to play with it, see how it works. I mean, when I've shown it too for other communities that maybe not familiar with that, I think the fact that it just plays, it just plays, right? So it starts off, and as they watch chunks of it, they become informed about the community. As they move through it, if they do engage in the interactivity, they get this kind of, not so much a specific story. It doesn't really ever lead to a specific story in the way we normally think of documentary stories, but it actually creates a portrait of the community, I think, like some kind of strange cubist fractured portrait of the community rather than a specific story, which is one of the reasons I think when I've showed this at, I was thinking I showed it at a conference, I was talking to you guys as a group here, and it was referred to as being documentative, but not a documentary. And I think that's the case. It's not a singular narrative like a documentary is normally structured.
Thank you.
Great. And Stephen, do you have any questions for Soja?
Yeah, I was really interested in that first project you did because I like the reflexivity and the autoethnographic quality of it, but I really wasn't fascinated with the superimposition of the virtual environment. One, I thought, oh, that'd be really disorientating in there, but then I thought it was quite beautiful the way it worked, and how the images kind of ghosted between each other. Could you explain how that functioned a little bit more? Because maybe this is me being a little bit technical, but I really enjoyed the way that looked.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much for that question. So it's really, really easy. I mean, it was coincidental because I try to edit to footage using Premiere Pro, and then I coincidentally kind of, sort of use that dissolves for a long time, and then I found that it's so weird, and then I just blended, half and half, and just try to find out how it looks like, and I just put in the Google, and which was super weird, and which reflects on my sensations or my feelings of where I located. So I kind of try to use those kind of coincidental findings as very actively to show that disorienting features of my feelings, and just because of I really let them questions of their own identity as well. And then I keep asking the questions of where are you now? So are you in Melbourne? Are you in Seoul? Are you in your body? Or are you in the virtual world? So which is actually kind of brings a lot of fundamental and metaphysical questions of what we are means and where you are and who you are. Yeah. It was really interesting. It was very effective things I found that it's just very simple, but it carries a lot of questionings around the VR and identity.
Yeah, no, I quite enjoyed it. And I love how it works, with that kind of metaphoric, about location and positioning oneself and those kinds of things. It's quite beautiful. And just quite literally quite beautiful the way it intersects. But so when people experience it in VR, how do they, what do they take away from it? Do they?
You mean that in generals or
Yeah.
the moments? About
that
project, about that project, the first project.
Yeah.
So especially a lot of people who are in the similar situation as the Asian immigrants, they project a lot. They just they just empathize or they identify with a lot. But I realized that there are a lot of densities of the information because I talk about Korea and Australia and family history. So there are a lot of audio-visual information. So many people missed a lot of important information. So because of that, when I exhibit the project, I put the timeline on the wall. So kind of like I had to kind of provide more archival curator context to experience the project based on more accurate context. And also that's the one of reason I create anonymous without not many words or not many informations, more like focus on the experience, because a lot of people just try to experience virtual reality, not try to find the information around. So yeah, I can see that still like too much audio-visual information for virtual reality is not really
Right. I see. Yeah. But I like how that it kind of would put the VR participant into this almost embodied experience of that dislocation of being somebody that's moving between cultures and moving between physical spaces, that kind of migration. I think that'd be really intriguing. Yeah.
I really want to explore that things with more other immigrants. So also as auto-ethnographic devices. Sorry, Pallavi.
Yeah, no, it's good.
I was saying I found it fascinating too, that this idea that, mostly a virtual world wants to be as close to the real as possible. But here that distinction was always there and standing out and saying, hey, and that idea of reflexivity rather than being totally what we call being empathetical. I found that very, very fascinating.
Thank you.
So I think at this point, for sake of time, we'll try to wrap. Sojung for coming. This has been an excellent conversation. It seems my internet connection is unstable, so if I'm freezing, I apologize. So thank you very much for all participating. Just as a reminder to everyone here, there are 2 more webinars of the series, and they're both actually next week. We have Soundscapes in the Story of Place on July 26th, and Immersive Storytelling, Negotiating Identity on July 28th. So please register for those if you wish to attend. Pallavi, do you have any final words?
I just wanted to thank Stephen and Sojung, and for a very, your presentations were fascinating, as so was the conversation, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So let's keep talking beyond this webinar as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you again. Yeah.
So
Thank you.
and
Thank you for the opportunity. It was great.
Yeah, so for future, it will be lovely if I can collaborate it with Stephen's, like any indigenous community or like diaspora using many different media. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for everyone joining us and spending time with us. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Yes. Bye. Thank you, and for everyone.
Thank you. Bye now.